From Peter Liem, the lauded expert behind the top-rated online resource, ChampagneGuide.net, comes this groundbreaking guide to the modern wines of Champagne, a region that in recent years has undergone one of the most dramatic transformations in the wine-growing world. This luxurious box set includes a pull-out tray with a complete set of 7 vintage vineyard maps by Louis Larmat, a rare, indispensable resource that beautifully documents the region's terroir. With extensive grower and vintner profiles, as well as a fascinating look at Champagne's history and lore, Champagne explores this legendary wine as never before. Hi, I'm Paul from Trending, Who, What, Where, and When. Today, I will be speaking with Peter Liem about his book, Champagne, The Essential Guide. Peter will be joining us from the Champagne region of France.
Hello, I'm Peter Liem. This is my book, Champagne. It comes packaged in a slipcase in which there's the book itself and a tray containing several vintage maps of the Champagne region. These maps describe the vineyards of Champagne, such as the one that I'm standing in, which is in the village of Cumières, a particularly famous wine-growing village. In the background, you can see the town of Epernay, which is where I live, and the scenery of the Champagne region. Champagne, like any other fine wine, is very much a product of the place where it's grown. And the main focus of my book is to describe the Champagne region and to illustrate how its wines reflect the places that they come from.
I'll start by asking where you would take friends and family when they come to visit you there.
Of course, Champagne is a very popular tourist destination, and there are a number of sites to see. Undoubtedly, the most famous is the cathedral in France. It was the current structure was started about in the 13th century, but it's built on an existing structure that goes back to the 5th century. But historically, it's been very important in France because that's where the kings of France were crowned. All the way up until the Revolution, and it's where Joan of Arc, made her famous ride to, with Charles VII and all of this. So, and the cathedral itself is very beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful in France. The stained glass is particularly nice, and even though it was heavily damaged during both world wars, a lot of the reconstruction has been very nice, and so particularly it's very famous now, for example, for its stained glass windows that were made by Marc Chagall in the 60s or 70s.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's something that everybody has to come see. Closer to Epernay is of course the abbey in Auvillers, which is where Dom Perignon himself, the monk Dom Perignon, worked and lived. And so the abbey, most of the abbey is owned by Moët & Chandon, and it's available only for private visits. But the chapel is open to the public, and and you can walk around and you can see it, and it's historically a famous place. But frankly, Champagne being a wine producing region, the vast majority of people who come here, they want to see wine cellars and they want to see wineries. There are thousands of wine producers here in Champagne, of course, there, and most of them are very eager to welcome you if you come and visit. So yeah, so it attracts a lot of people.
Tell us something about your background, the steps leading up to writing Champagne, The Essential Guide.
Well, I've been working with wine my whole adult life. I got into the wine trade directly out of college. I went to a liberal arts school and really studied for the sake of education and not for a career. And so as badly as I wanted to go to graduate school, I couldn't really justify the expense, so I decided to get a job instead, and I got a job at a wine store, and it was magnificent. I began learning so much, and I was so engaged in what I was doing that I made this a career. And so I worked in the wine trade for quite a while. In all aspects of the trade. I worked in retail, in restaurants, I worked in importing. I eventually opened a wine bar of my own with a couple of friends, and that was nice. But since 2004, I've been exclusively a wine writer. And initially, I had never thought about getting into wine writing, but Wine and Spirits magazine in New York offered me a job, so I took it, and I worked for them up until 2011, and since then I've been entirely independent.
So you started your own company, your own online guide to champagne.
In 2004, when I began working for Wine and Spirits, I was living in New York City full time. And I had already been coming to the Champagne region for a long time. Since 1997, I had been making annual trips to Champagne. And it was a region I was heavily invested in, and I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to spend as much time here as possible. And so in 2006, at the end of 2006, actually, I made the decision to move full-time to France and move to the Champagne region, simply to immerse myself, in the land, in the culture, in the to experience wine growing, from the inside. And so since 2006, I've made my home here in Champagne. In 2009, I started ChampagneGuide.net, which is my my online guide to Champagne, and it was really due to there not being many available resources on Champagne. Today it's a little bit different. There are more people working with Champagne, there are more people writing about Champagne, and we're better for it. But at the time, and that was one of the reasons that I moved here. Well, that was the primary reason that I moved here, in fact, was that the things that I wanted to learn, I couldn't read in books, or I couldn't read in magazines, I couldn't read online. I had to learn them here. And so ChampagneGuide.net was my way of transmitting that knowledge to others. It's a subscription site, it's an annual subscription, and it's quite specialized. So maybe it's not for everyone, but I think that if for very detailed information on Champagne, that's its purpose.
Well, tell us about your book, Champagne: The Essential Guide. You've divided it into 3 different parts.
Yeah, so I wrote my book. Well, I guess it was published in 2012. There have been many Champagne books, or many books written about Champagne, in the last 100 years. I felt that there was room for something new. I felt that that a lot of the books that were being written in the 20th century, early 21st, were a little bit the same, and were sort of based on this paradigm that no longer existed. I had been coming to Champagne since 1997, and so I had seen firsthand the changes that were happening in the region, and it was a region that was changing dramatically and changing rapidly. And like I said, these weren't things that you could read about. These weren't things that anybody was writing about. And so I had it in my head for a while, how do I write about this? And it took some prodding. It really took my agent to really convince me to take on this large project. But yeah, I spent 2 years dedicated to writing this book, and I was quite happy with the way that it turned out. So as you say, it was it's roughly divided into 3 parts. The first is about introducing Champagne, Champagne as a region, Champagne as a wine. It talks about the history of Champagne, and it talks about production and viticulture. But I think it does it from quite a specific point of view. The real underlying thesis of the whole book is terroir. This French idea. Well, it's a French word. It's not necessarily a French idea, but the idea of terroir is that a wine reflects the place that it comes from. Very simple. It's not just soil, but it's soil, its slope, its sun, its wind. All of these things contribute to the character of a wine. And I think that most people who are heavily invested in wine would agree that this is what makes wine interesting. It's that wine reflects the place that it comes from. And in Champagne, if you go back a long ways in Champagne, you see that the idea of terroir has always been very, very important for the region and for the wine. It wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century that we began to lose this a little bit. And Champagne began to be better known for its process, the way that the wine was made, and it began to really be sold as a brand rather than a wine. And marketing-wise, this was hugely successful. It made them a lot of money. It made Champagne famous around the world. As far as Champagne being taken seriously as a wine, I think that kind of worked to its detriment. And so this idea of terroir, this idea of really detailed specificity of place, the Champenois in the latter part of the 20th century, they still talked about terroir, but very much on a macro scale. They talked about Champagne as a region and Champagne as a wine reflecting the region. But the thing is that Champagne has always been divided into smaller subregions, into different villages, into in different areas within the appellation, and it's always been known that these places have different characteristics. It's just that we stopped talking about this for a while, and I wanted to restart this conversation. I wanted to refocus the conversation on this idea of Champagne as a place and Champagne as a wine that reflects place. And honestly, it wasn't just me. It wasn't my big initiative. This was what was happening on the ground at the time in Champagne that nobody was talking about. And so so when in writing this book, of course, I wanted it to be a complete work on Champagne. I wanted it to be completely accessible to someone who knew nothing about Champagne. You can pick it up and start reading from page 1, and I wanted it to encapsulate everything that I wanted you to know. But at the same time, I think I approached the topic from quite a slanted point of view. It's this idea that, like, putting terroir as the primary focus of even talking about the history of Champagne, even talking about the production methods, really focusing the conversation on place. And so the second part of the book, which is my favorite and which I think is the most original, is really an in-depth discussion of Champagne as a place and a discussion of the various terroirs of Champagne. I'm not saying that it's the definitive word, but I think I tried to discuss the terroir of Champagne in a way that's more in depth than we have been talking about it so far in the modern day, and to sort of establish a foundation, sort of jumping off point where we can use this to talk about deeper issues and to explore the idea of terroir more in Champagne. And so, here in this section, I divide up Champagne into several different subregions. I go really in depth into each subregion and talk about characteristics of the area, how the wines are different from one place to another. Talk with key producers within each of these subregions and try and get their perspectives. And so it's an exploration of place. And then the final section of the book is about the producers themselves. And so I have producer profiles. It's not an encyclopedic, collection of champagne producers, but it's a selection of about 100 producers that I think at the time of writing were very relevant to the topics of discussion, who reflected something something very contemporary and something very terroir focused and just important people, for the discussion at hand.
I noticed that a number of those people on your Facebook, it looks like they invite you to come and join them when they're doing tastings, and they value your opinion on how to go forward with some of the items.
Yeah, I mean, having been here for so long, and having been invested in the region for so long, of course, I've made a lot of friends here, and so I have a lot of good relationships with a lot of producers. So for ChampagneGuide.net, I do all of my professional tasting here in the region, and I much prefer to do it. I know most critics like to get samples and taste them at home or in your office, and I mean, this is fantastic because it can be very leisurely, and you can really spend time on these wines. I like that too, but I prefer to do it with the producers themselves, so that I can have conversations with them. We can taste wines together. I can really, for me, wine is all about context. It's not just about what's in your glass. In order to really understand the wine, you have to understand the context around it. And so this is why I like tasting with the producers themselves. And so I do this a lot.
That would really give you a lot of depth that you would otherwise not get if they just sent the bottle and you're tasting it, at your house or in your library.
Yeah, if you don't have previous knowledge of the wine, then you're missing some context, and you may not be able to understand the wine as completely as you might have, if you're tasting it with the person who made it.
So that'd be one of the benefits of having a subscription, is that information be included with that on your website.
Yeah, I try, and my website is it's aimed at a very geeky level of champagne connoisseur. It's unabashedly geeky, and so it might be overwhelming for some, but this is the idea.
I'd like to show this. This was just a great book. I was so impressed when we got it. There's so much information.
Thank you. And I really have to thank the book designers at 10 Speed Press. The primary book designer, she was genius. It was her whole idea to package this in this slipcase with I wanted to feature these maps. I didn't really know how, and it was her idea to package them in this format, and it came out really, really well.
Tell us about those maps. That's incredible, getting all those large format maps from the distant past.
Yeah, so there was this publisher, Louis Larmat, in the mid 20th century, and so it was the INAO, the French sort of wine authorities, who commissioned him to make these detailed maps of all the important French wine regions. And so he started doing this in the 1940s, or I don't even know how this was possible at this time in France. But so you see these collections of these maps that he published from Burgundy, from Bordeaux, from the Loire Valley, and Champagne, for whatever reason, is one of the rarest. And so he published them. I actually have the original right here. So he published them in this sort of large folio. It's an unbound folio.
Okay.
And so I mean, this is quite fragile, but this opens up, and then there are all these, and then inside, he packaged all these maps. So these maps are just kind of folded, and so there are seven different maps of various regions within Champagne, and then he has some other there are some other pages with text in various languages. That's not very interesting. There are some photos which aren't very interesting. It's really the maps themselves that are are of value, because up until this point, these were the most detailed vineyard maps that we had of Champagne. And so these were initially they were published in a very tiny quantity. There were reprints over some years, but then they vanished from the public view. They vanished from the world. They became extremely difficult to find, and I had found out, of the existence of them in the late 1990s, and I was scouring, auctions and antiquarian booksellers, and just all over the world. I was really just asking people to try and find these things, and to no avail, really. And even champagne producers at that time, most champagne producers didn't even know of the existence of these maps. And so finally, I was offered a complete set in the original folio. And this was around 2003, 2004. And so, finally, I was able to get a copy of these, and that completely changed my understanding of Champagne, because for the first time I had these maps are from the 1940s. So of course the vineyard area has changed. You can see, you can certainly see how the vineyard area was much smaller back then. There are a few parcels where the names have been changed a little bit, but still the bulk of it remains intact. And even today, they remain an extremely useful tool just for exploring the Champagne vineyards. And so, of course, the maps continue to be nowadays I see them more and more. Sometimes you can go on eBay. Especially with the internet, now you can go on eBay. You can sometimes at auction, I see these maps pop up, but they remain relatively rare. They remain very costly. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with my book was sort of democratize these maps, and make them available to a larger public. And so I was very happy that we were able to do that.
Well, they're interesting. I spent a lot of time looking at them, laying them out. They're large format.
They are, yeah. They're large. They're beautiful. They're very detailed. Even today, we don't have any publicly available maps of Champagne vineyards that are as detailed as this. There are the kind of official, landowner maps, but those are available for vineyard owners only. So they're not available to people like us. Nobody has really taken on a project like this. Now I have a friend, Charles Curtis. I'll just give him a plug. He, along with a map maker named Steve DeLong, the two of them have begun actually doing very detailed maps of Champagne vineyards and villages. And it's a little bit different than this, but they're going village by village and trying to recreate extremely detailed vineyard maps. And so this is something that's really valuable. And this is the first time that anyone has publicly taken on a project like this since Larmat. So that's very exciting. And so I'm very excited to see how this project evolves.
And then they're going to sell them online or do something like that with them?
Yes. They've already started selling too. These are the first, kind of modern day vineyard maps that we have of Champagne since the time of Louis Larmat in the 40s. But so because of that, the Larmat maps remain highly relevant, and so they're still a very valuable tool.
Would you please discuss with us Champagne's vineyards Échelle de Crus classification system?
Yeah, so so the Échelle de Crus was it was sort of the last official classification of Champagne. Like many other vineyards, like most other vineyard areas of the world, there were always not always, but there were frequently attempts to classify vineyards and in a hierarchy of quality, which was always related to price, economics. The first time that we really saw a classification, to my knowledge, was in 1816. There was this guy, a wine writer named André Julien, and he wrote a book called The Topography of All the Known Wines of the World. and so this book was really revolutionary because, well, one, it talked about wine regions that nobody knew anything about, but then also he went to regions like Champagne, and so in Champagne for the first time he talked about terroir in this really detailed manner, and created this classification of Champagne's terroir, and over the next 60 or 70 years, he came out with further editions of this book where he refined these classifications, going into about, I don't know, 1870 or so, like late 19th century. Then there were official classifications in the region to try and establish. It all had to do with grape pricing, right? So Champagne, unlike some other wine regions, or I guess to take it back farther, in the modern day, we sort of have this idea of a winery being of kind of a vineyard owners and winery and winemakers sort of being the same. So you own a vineyard, you grow the grapes, you make the wine, and then you sell it. And in a lot of the New World, this is how it works. In a lot of wine regions, this is kind of what we think of as the norm. In Champagne, historically, it has not been this way. So the people who own the vines and harvest the grapes are very different from the people who make the wine, or historically. It's actually been like this in a lot of European wine regions, but Champagne is sort of an extreme in this way. So because you had these winemakers, these houses called négociants, they were purchasing grapes from grape growers. So they wanted to establish a pricing scheme. And because already we knew that certain terroirs in Champagne were better than others, or they were more highly prized. People really wanted grapes from these specific villages because they felt that they made better wine. So there were a number of attempts to kind of classify these vineyards. It didn't really happen until 1911. And then it took between like 1911 to 1919, was really the birth of the Échelle de Crus. So the idea of the Échelle was quite simple. It was a percentage scale. And so what would happen is that every year there would be a fixed price for grapes, like say just an imaginary number, 10 francs, right? So if 10 francs is the price for grapes, then the vineyards rated at 100% would get the full amount. If your vineyard is rated at 92%, then you would get 92% of that amount. So you get 9 francs 20 or whatever. And so initially the vineyards were rated between 50 and 100. Later on, that bottom level of 50 came up. So by the end, I think by the 1980s, it was like 75% or something was the bottom. I don't quite remember. But the idea was that vineyards rated at 100% were Grand Cru, and vineyards rated between 90 and 99% were Premier Cru. And so the price was always fixed every year. This was how much you would, if you had Grand Cru land, this was how much money you would get for your grapes. If you had Premier Cru, this is how much you would get. In the late 20th century, capitalism kind of took over, and people began getting dissatisfied with with this structure. So there was quite a bit of grumbling. I don't remember the exact year that it was around 99 or 2000 that this finally they finally stopped using the system and allowed growers to negotiate prices directly with the negociants. I think 2003 was, after 2003, then the Échelle de Crus was officially dead. And so today it's today people are free to negotiate whatever contracts they want with with grape growers. The idea or the terms Grand Cru and Premier Cru still exist. They don't carry quite as much weight here as they do in, say, Burgundy, just because of the way that the vineyards are structured. But you still see these terms on wine labels. I don't pay very much attention to them, but some consumers do, and they exist. So, but the Échelle de Crus itself is no longer a tool that's being actively used.
That's a great explanation. Thank you. Is there any passage from your book that you would like to read and share with us?
Yeah, I could read a short one. Like I said, the whole underlying thesis is really the focus on place and focus on vineyards and focus on Champagne as a wine of terroir. And so, early on in my book, when I'm introducing the idea of Champagne, I wrote this 10 years ago, but it remains true. Today, Champagne is in the midst of a profound change. Over the past 2 decades, I've seen a palpable shift in the attitudes and aesthetics of Champagne producers, as well as a change in perceptions about the wine among Champagne consumers and wine professionals. Much of the discussion about Champagne in the last half-century has focused on processes that take place in the cellar, such as the art of blending, the creation of sparkle through fermentation in bottle, and the wine's aging on its lees. These all play a fundamental role in creating Champagne's inimitable character. However, as is the case with others in the modern wine world, winemakers in Champagne are increasingly acknowledging that the most individual, authentic, and meaningful wines derive their primary identity from the vines, not the winemaking. While the 20th century was about perfecting cellar practices, the 21st century is focused on the region's vines, and it's in the vineyards that Champagne's contemporary philosophical, cultural, and intellectual debates are taking place. And I think that this is, this represents a very central theme of my book. And I think that is a very true statement about contemporary Champagne. Champagne has been an extremely famous, arguably the most famous wine in the world for a very long time. And yet the region and the wine today is markedly different from what it was even just 20 or 25 years ago. And much of it has to do with this rethinking of Champagne, rethinking the wine of Champagne, rethinking Champagne as a product of place, rethinking Champagne as rethinking the vineyards of Champagne and the viticulture of Champagne. And these are some of the most important topics in Champagne today.
You've won a lot of awards with this book. Would you care to tell us about a list of awards, which we'll put in the text? Would you like to tell us about some of the awards?
Yeah, so the most prestigious award, of course, that somebody in my position can receive is the James Beard Award, which it's a series of awards that are given in the culinary and wine world, and so my book won a James Beard Award, which I was extremely proud of, very important to me. Sort of the British equivalent of that is the Andre Simon Award, which my book also won. And so I was also extremely proud about that. It's won a number of other awards, and it's not to make light of those or anything, but those it's unusual for a wine book to win to win both of the big awards, and so I was pretty humbled to to have done that with my book.
Tell us about the research you did in preparing this book.
It was about 2 years of really focused research and writing that I specifically for this book, but it really drew upon 20 years of being in the region, of tasting, of being involved in the world of champagne. I still feel like this is always an ongoing process. It's I've never stopped learning about wine. I've never stopped learning about champagne. And so I feel like maybe this book is sort of a snapshot in time, and maybe I'm sure, well, there's no doubt that the region continues to evolve, the wine continues to evolve. I'm sure my own views will continue to evolve. But yeah, this book, I guess, really represents sort of the entirety of my career to date in Champagne.
So what are your favorite parts of the book?
I think the central portion, the second section where I really talk about the terroir of Champagne, I think that's something that's a little unique. I go more into depth, on this subject than most books being written on Champagne today. And I guess I talk about it in a little different way than other people. Everybody divides Champagne into various subregions, but I did it in a kind of unique way. Not everybody will agree with it, maybe, but that's okay. Again, like I said, this can function as a jumping off point for further discussion, and that's fine with me. But I really wanted to bring attention to these nuanced differences in the Champagne region, in various areas of the Champagne region, and to really highlight these and discuss them in a meaningful way. And so I guess I like this section for its originality. I think maybe though another one of my favorite parts that people often overlook is the history section. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people, every Champagne book has a history section, right? And so all of the major events in Champagne history you can learn about from reading any book. But like I said, mine is a little bit different because of its slant, because of its focus on terroir. And so I think that I think my history section is maybe a little bit subtle, but it's quite different from other books as well.
Oh, was anything that you wrote in the book end up being controversial?
Not necessarily. Maybe, I mean, the way that I divided up these subregions, I'm sure that some people might take issue with this, but it's not, I'm not deliberately being controversial. I outline in the book, I outline, very clearly my reasons for the choices that I make. And yeah, and I, like I said, I like this being a point of discussion.
So about a month ago, there's a lot in the news in the United States about Russia and France and the Champagne labeling controversy. Is that news, or is that going away, or?
It's kind of a non-issue. So it was Russia kind of flexing its muscle. In the end, it doesn't really have a lot of impact. As far as I understand it, in the end, it's Russia saying that the word champagne, as written in Cyrillic, can only be used on sparkling wine that comes from Russia. So champagne can't even, isn't even allowed to write champagne in Cyrillic characters on the wine labels. They have to call it sparkling wine or something. And this, from the outside, this seems ridiculous. but I think that in the end, it's really not that big a deal, and nobody even really talks about it anymore.
Okay, because actually we had talked to people here and they said that Russia won't even import wine if it says champagne on the bottle, even though it comes from that area.
Yeah, they still, Russia imports, a lot of champagne. Obviously, it's a big market, and it's always been. But it's just this little detail in labeling that so champagne also has to put in Cyrillic script. It has to put the word sparkling champagne or sparkling wine, or something, rather than saying champagne. It's completely silly.
What advice would you give to champagne enthusiasts that want to visit the champagne villages of France?
Well, I would certainly encourage people to come here. It's a beautiful region, and wine producers tend to be quite open and quite willing. As long as they have time, they're very willing to see you. They're quite excited about people coming to taste. I would say, for all except the largest places, like if you're going to Pommery or if you're going to Moet and Chandon, you can probably, they have a visitor center, you can walk in, things like that. But smaller, especially smaller producers, it's always nice to make an appointment ahead of time. Mm-hmm. So just Google their info and give them a call. Most people, almost every winery has at least one person who speaks English, so it's quite cosmopolitan here, and yeah, it's better for you and for them if you make an appointment ahead of time, but in general, yeah, if you want to come and visit your favorite producer, they would probably be happy to see you.
Do you think we'll see your book as a documentary or a Netflix series?
Unfortunately, no. I would like to do more video work around Champagne, but it probably won't be
it won't be with Netflix.
It won't be directly, well, it won't be Netflix, unfortunately, but it's probably not going to be not going to be directly linked to the book. It's it would probably be a separate project. I don't have anything in the works now, but I've always thought about doing more video projects.
Are you working on any upcoming books?
I am not at the moment. I've talked with my agent about soon doing a revision of this book, just a slight one, but that probably won't be for another few years at least. Okay. And yeah, so right now I'm really focusing on ChampagneGuide.net.
Previous books, you wrote a book about sherry?
Yeah, so I wrote a book on sherry with my friend Jesus Barquin. Jesus is one of the foremost sherry experts in the world, and it was at a time when there hadn't been a new book on sherry in the English language since 1988. And so, of course, this, a lot of this material was outdated. The sherry region, sherry has always been a wine that I've been very passionate about as a consumer and as a wine professional. But there hasn't, up until this point, there hadn't been a lot that was written about sherry, in the modern day. And I felt that it was time for a new sherry book. And I asked around, to see if someone was writing one, and nobody was. So I thought, I'll do it. So I approached Jesus about it, and he also owns a sherry producer called Equipo Navados. And so because of his involvement with making sherry, he felt he's written a lot of articles for various Spanish magazines and things, but he felt uncomfortable writing a book himself, just because this kind of conflict of interest, being a producer himself. So he encouraged me to write this book, and we're both listed as authors, but the way that the way that book happened was he basically gave me all of his, everything he had ever written on sherry, all of his articles and all of his material from the past, and said, you can use this however you want. I trust you. I have no problems. And incorporate this material however you want. So I translated, a lot of his information, and because we had been tasting together for so long, I've learned so much from him. Our ideas, I guess we approach sherry from a very similar place anyway. So it made a lot of sense, just the way that we did it. But I ended up writing the book. I also conceived that as a self-published project from the very beginning. So that was my one and only foray into self-publishing, and it was very interesting. I learned a lot. I printed 5,000 copies, which for a wine book, wine books really don't sell very well at all. So 5,000 I thought was quite ambitious, but it ended up selling out, which was great. Recently, we kind of did a revised version of the book. It's not really the same book. It draws on the same material, but we enlisted a couple of other friends who are sherry experts, to kind of collaborate with us, and we did a sort of updated Spanish language book. Unfortunately, it's available only in Spanish. That's available for sale. The original English language version, unfortunately, is out of print. It's sold out, and that's become very, very difficult to find.
Would you share with us your involvement in the Wine Scholars Guild's Champagne Master Level Program?
Yeah, so the Wine Scholar Guild it's an organization based in the United States. It's a wine education program, and yeah, so a number of years ago, they invited me to be one of the instructors in their program. I think it's quite unique in the wine world. It's very well organized. What I like about it is the array of instructors that they have. So when you take this course, the master level course, you're not just learning from me. You're learning from like 10 or 12 of the world's foremost champagne experts. So everybody is approaching it from a different point of view. Everybody has their own kind of niche within their own specialty within the world of champagne. Certainly everybody knows what they're talking about at a very, very high level, and so I think it's quite unique. Yeah, I don't think that there's really another champagne education program that has this kind of breadth of involvement. And so we've done it twice as sort of a series of live seminars that have been taped, and then and now you can do it by video. But I think that live seminar format was quite successful. I mean, it was nice, but it's a big time commitment, to have people come 12 weeks in a row or whatever for so many seminars. So I think, we're going to do another one, another kind of updated, masterclass next year. And I think we're going to do more video recording and, we're going to change the format a little bit, try and pack, again, have this wide breadth of instructors, have this, very detail oriented, very high level of champagne education, but maybe change the format just a little bit.
They look really interesting and informative.
Yeah. I enjoy seeing what the other instructors have to say, and everybody who's involved with that is an expert in their subject. So it's really fascinating.
The other thing I found that was really interesting is your Fête du Champagne in New York City.
So Fête du Champagne, it was certainly the first event of its kind in the world. It's still one of the only events, that's kind of on this scale. It's, I guess, again, the focus is on education. So, we do a lot of seminars, tastings, sort of dinners arranged around a theme. The centerpiece of the event is a grand tasting in which we invite about 35 or 40 producers to come over from Champagne. One of the things that I wanted from the beginning was to involve both famous houses and smaller growers. So in most Champagne events around the world, you'll either have one or the other, and for me, it was very important to include both. And also, I think what's interesting about our event is that it's always a principal personality from one of these producers. So we want either the owner or the winemaker or like somebody significant from that producer to come and present their wines. A lot of wine tasting around the world, it's their importer pouring it, or maybe it's a salesperson or something like this, and so for us, it's really also a chance for you as a consumer to meet the people behind the wines, and that's a very important part of it as well. We also have a gala dinner, in which all these producers take part. They bring special cuvées of their own, but then also all of the guests are encouraged to bring wine from their own cellars. So it becomes an extremely festive event where people share magnificent bottles of champagne, and it's always a very exciting time.
I didn't see that about the guests bringing their own. Also, that's different.
Yeah, that's sort of the theme of the gala dinner every year.
Okay.
And then people dig deep in their cellars and bring magnificent bottles.
Do you have any advice for new writers that you'd like to share?
Well, wine writing is challenging. The pay is notoriously low, especially for the amount of knowledge and experience that's required. So it's not very attractive, certainly for new writers. But I guess when people ask me about it, one of the things that I always think is useful is specialization. In the past, you had, I think the previous generation or generations of wine writers, they really talked about the wines of the world. So, approaching the wine world as a whole, I might write an article about Burgundy, I might write an article about South Africa, I might write an article about Tokai, an article about Champagne, and that's fine. That's great. But I think that if you're going to do that, you can only access these areas in kind of a limited depth. I think that today the wine world is so large, and regions have become so complex, and so it takes such a heavy involvement to really understand a wine region, in a meaningful way, that I think that what I find most interesting is people who specialize in particular wine regions or wine areas. I've done it with Champagne. I feel that I very much enjoy visiting other wine regions and tasting other wines and talking to other wine producers, but I just feel like even for just what I want to do in Champagne, 365 days a year isn't enough. So I don't really have any time to become an expert in another wine region. So I encourage specialization. I encourage people to really dig deeper rather than broader.
And when you were writing your book and it took the 2 years, did you write every day or most every day?
Yeah, I think I did, or I tried. The writing process, doesn't come as easily to me as maybe some other people. It's something that I often struggle with. So I'm not, I'm certainly not a, someone who can just sit down and crank out 3,000 words a day.
Okay.
Um, you know, um, and I admire those who can. But yeah, it was um, it was a long process. It was an arduous one. Ultimately, it was rewarding, and I'm glad that I did it. But maybe this is why I'm not really jumping back into another book right away.